I've been a bushpine in Alaska for about 5 years. It's a job for the independent and mechanically inclined, folks who can keep calm under pressure. Unlike thrill seekers who tend to disappear into the wilderness or wash out quickly, it takes a clear headed approach to survive out here. My plane, Maggie, a de Havilland DHC-2 Beaver, has saved my skin more times than I can count. She's my steadfast companion, pristine and solar yellow, perfect for Alaska's challenging skies. This story began like many others. I had just returned from a supply run to a ranger station near Denali. Back at the hangar, sipping coffee, I was ready to unwind after a long day. But the radio crackled, pulling me back to duty. "Go for Logan," I said, already feeling my evening slipping away. Buck, my dispatcher, wasted no time. "We've got an emergency hoop. Ranger station near Birch Creek. Someone's had a run-in with a brown bear. It's bad." I sighed but knew the unspoken rule. Out here, you always answer the call for help. I agreed, heading out to help Dan refit Maggie for the trip. My relaxing evening had officially turned into a race against time. An hour later, Maggie and I were wheels up, heading northeast towards Birch Creek. The late February skies were clear when we departed, though a distant line of storm clouds loomed on the horizon. With just over 2 hours before sunset, I calculated I had enough time to reach the ranger station, pick up the injured person, and return to Fairbanks before dark. For the first 30 minutes, the flight was smooth. Maggie's radial engine thrummed with a steady rhythm, and the landscape below stretched endlessly in its snow-covered majesty. But then the storm ahead began moving faster, much faster than I liked. The horizon turned gray-black, and the clouds swirled ominously, lightning flickering in the distance. As if that weren't enough, I started to feel a subtle, intermittent vibration from the engine. At first, I hoped it was just my imagination, but soon it became undeniable. The steady drone of the 9-cylinder engine faltered now and then, a problem that could easily turn catastrophic in this remote wilderness. Turning back wasn't an option. A man's life depended on me reaching the ranger station. But as the storm overtook me, swallowing the afternoon light, and the engine's hiccups became more pronounced, I knew I had a choice to make. The air grew turbulent, tossing Maggie like a kite in a gale. The clouds thickened, visibility dropped, and I was flying blind, relying on my instruments. The storm had me in its grip, and Maggie's failing engine threatened to deliver us into its wrath. I called dispatch. "Viking ground, Viking 320 Foxtrot. I've hit some nasty weather and started picking up engine issues. I'm aborting the pickup and heading back." Buck's voice came back through the static, calm but concerned. "Roger that, Hoop. Adjust your heading to 185 degrees and drop to 900 feet to avoid the worst of it." I followed his advice, but it was clear I was running out of time and options. The storm clouds churned around me, lightning illuminating the skeletal trees below. The groaning of Maggie's airframe hinted at her limits. I descended further, seeking calmer air, but found myself dangerously close to the treetops. Then came the final warning. A loud metallic pop from above my head, followed by a half-second engine cutout. My heart raced. I needed to find a place to land. Fast. With the storm's fury pounding Maggie and the engine struggling to hold on, I scanned the snow-covered wilderness below for any sign of salvation. The thick, clawing trees stretched endlessly, their snow-laden tops piercing the low-hanging clouds. The storm blinded me to almost everything except the immediate danger of crashing. Another violent gust rocked the plane, and I fought to keep control. The engine sputtered again, this time more severe. A cold realization crept in. If the engine failed entirely, I'd lose airspeed, and Maggie would tumble into an unrecoverable death spiral. My hands tightened on the yoke as I prayed for a miracle. Then, through a brief parting in the storm clouds, I saw it. A small, rectangular shape carved out of the wilderness. It was a landing strip, covered in snow, but unmistakable. Relief surged through me. It was my only chance. I adjusted my approach, fighting the turbulent wind as Maggie's wings dipped and swayed. Snow streaked across the windshield, and the tailwind made it nearly impossible to slow down. I was coming in too fast, but there was no alternative. At 200 feet, the towering trees loomed on either side of the narrow clearing. The altimeter wound down rapidly, and I braced myself, pulling the yoke back gently as Maggie's Tundra tires skimmed the snow. The impact was harder than I'd have liked, jarring every part of me, but the big tires did their job, cushioning the landing as we rolled to a halt. I killed the engine and slumped forward, forehead resting on the yoke. My hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline coursing through me. Maggie had saved me once again, but I wasn't out of danger yet. The snow was falling thickly, and the storm's howling winds obscured the world around me. Through the cockpit windows, I could make out the towering trees lining the strip and the deep shadows they cast. My first task was to assess the situation and find shelter before nightfall. Reaching into my jacket, I activated my emergency locator beacon, hoping it would transmit my location to rescue services. But I knew help wouldn't come quickly in these conditions. I had to rely on myself, and maybe, just maybe, there was someone nearby. I caught a faint scent of wood smoke on the icy wind. Heart pounding, I grabbed my emergency pack and rifle, pulled on my heavy coat, and stepped into the snow. The biting wind hit me like a slap as I stepped out of Maggie. The snow was knee-deep, making each step a slog. The scent of wood smoke was faint but unmistakable, carried on the icy air like a lifeline. If there was smoke, there had to be fire, and fire meant shelter. Circling the plane, I scanned the dense forest surrounding the landing strip. My eyes caught a small structure at the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the swirling snow. It looked like a utility shed, weathered and unassuming, but next to it was something far more promising, a waist-high wooden railing marking a path into the trees. Gripping my rifle tightly, I trudged toward the shed and the trail. The wind lessened as I entered the forest, the thick canopy above muffling the storm's fury. Snow still drifted down in gentle swirls, a strange contrast to the chaos I'd just escaped. The air here felt almost alive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The handrail guided me forward, the wooden planks of the path crunching faintly beneath my boots. The scent of wood smoke grew stronger with each step, mingling with the crisp, earthy smell of the forest. My heart raced with cautious hope. After several minutes, the path widened and a building emerged from the shadows. A large, low structure, far more substantial than the hunting cabin I'd expected. It looked modern, with clean lines and sturdy construction, standing out starkly against the wilderness around it. A sign, nearly buried in snow, caught my eye. I brushed it off and read, White River Basin Agricultural Research Center, a government post. Relief washed over me. This wasn't some isolated homestead, it was a facility. That meant people, resources, and most importantly, a way to contact help. I approached the building quickly, eager to escape the cold and regroup. Just as I reached the door, it swung open violently, spilling yellow light into the snow. A man stepped out, shotgun raised, his wild eyes locking on me. "Stop right there," he shouted, his voice sharp and trembling. "Don't come any closer." My breath caught as I froze, hands instinctively rising. "Whoa, whoa, easy," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to cause trouble." "Drop the rifle," he ordered, his finger twitching near the trigger. "Nice and slow." I obeyed, setting the rifle down carefully in the snow. The man's eyes darted over me, scanning for any threat. He looked rough, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes and a patchy government-issued coat hanging loosely from his shoulders. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you doing here?" "I'm Logan," I replied evenly. "Bush pilot. My plane went down in the storm, and I spotted your landing strip. I'm just looking for shelter." The man hesitated, then nodded slightly, as if convincing himself of something. "Take off your goggles," he said, his voice softer but no less tense. I complied, pulling the tinted lenses away to meet his gaze directly. He studied me for a long moment before lowering the shotgun. "Well, Logan," he said, stepping back into the doorway, "come on inside. It's too damned cold out here." The tension lingered as I retrieved my rifle and followed him into the building, unsure whether I'd just found salvation or stepped into something far worse. The warmth inside the building was a sharp contrast to the freezing wilderness I'd just left. The man led me into a wood-paneled room with sparse furnishings, a couch along one wall, a roaring fireplace opposite, and a small table near the fire with a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He gestured vaguely toward the room. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, pouring himself a drink. "Name's Victor Tate. I'm with the field research team here. Or what's left of it." I stayed near the door, still wary. The man's disheveled appearance and wild eyes didn't inspire confidence. "What do you mean? What's left of it?" I asked. Victor smirked, his lips twitching with an unsettling mix of amusement and unease. It's been a rough week. Let's put it that way. He downed his whiskey in one gulp and poured another. The room's quiet, aside from the crackling fire, felt heavy. My gaze wandered to a row of hooks by the door, several coats hanging there. Are you the only one here? Victor followed my line of sight, his smirk fading. Now, yeah, he said simply, the weight of those words lingering in the air. My patience was wearing thin. Look, I've had a hell of a day. My plane barely made it down, and I've got no way to call for help. If there's something I need to know, now's the time to share. Victor leaned back in his chair, staring into his glass as though searching for answers. Finally, he looked up at me, his expression dark. You don't want to know, he said. Trust me. That's not good enough, I snapped. I've got a busted plane and a locator beacon that might not even be working. I need to know what's going on. Victor sighed, his shoulders slumping. All right, fine, he said, setting his glass down with a thud. But don't say I didn't warn you. He stood and motioned for me to follow. We walked through a door marked restricted access, entering a narrow, sterile corridor lit by fluorescent lights. The stark contrast to the cozy front room made my skin crawl. Victor led me to a heavy metal door at the end of the hallway, punching a code into a keypad. With a soft click, the door unlocked, and he pushed it open, revealing a room that sent a chill through me. The space was clinical and cold, filled with rows of stainless steel tables and laboratory equipment. The antiseptic smell stung my nose. Along the far wall were several examination tables, some draped with white cloths covering unidentifiable shapes. What is this place? I asked, my voice low. Victor leaned against one of the tables, a grim smile on his face. The White River Basin Agricultural Research Center, he said, echoing the sign outside. We were supposed to study wildlife migration patterns and climate change. But that's not why you're here, is it? His cryptic tone set my nerves on edge. What happened here, Victor? His smile vanished, replaced by a haunted look. That storm last week, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It wasn't just a storm. It brought them. I frowned, unsure what he meant. Them? Who are you talking about? Victor's eyes burned with intensity as he answered. The shadows. I stared at him, confused. Shadows? What are you talking about? Victor pushed off the table and motioned toward another door at the back of the room. Come with me, he said. You need to see it for yourself. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse, but curiosity and a gnawing sense of dread pushed me to follow. Victor led me down a stark, narrow hallway, his boots clicking against the tiled floor. The air was heavy with the sterile scent of antiseptic, but there was something else beneath it. Faint and metallic, a smell that made my stomach twist. He stopped at a door marked OR2, entered a code on the keypad, and pushed it open. The room beyond was small and cold, with an unsettling clinical atmosphere. Lockers and lab coats lined one wall, while a console on the opposite side glowed faintly with rows of monitors. Above the console, a large observation window dominated the space, revealing a room completely consumed by darkness. Victor sat at the console, his fingers flying across the keyboard. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as though he were speaking more to himself than to me. They said it couldn't be done, but I proved them wrong. I caught one. A chill ran down my spine. Caught what? I asked, my voice tight. Victor didn't look up. The shadows, he said simply. I stared at the observation window, my pulse quickening. What do you mean, shadows? What's in there? Victor finally turned to me, his expression filled with a strange mix of pride and unease. You'll see. Before I could respond, he raised his hand and pounded on the observation window. The sound was sharp, jarring in the quiet room, and the glass shuddered under the force. That's when I noticed it. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It moved. It recoiled from the glass, shifting like smoke drawn by an invisible force. The motion was fluid, almost unnatural, and as it pulled back, a faint, high-pitched screech echoed through the air. The light revealed what had been hidden, and my breath caught in my throat. Scattered across the floor of the room were skeletal remains. They were stark white, stripped of all flesh and arranged in unnatural, chaotic poses. Some skeletons were intact, their forms frozen mid-movement, while others were shattered, their fragments scattered like broken porcelain. What am I looking at? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Victor turned back to me, his eyes alight with a manic intensity. "It's extraordinary, isn't it?" he said. "The others thought I was crazy, but I managed to contain it. It's been here ever since." I stumbled back, the weight of what I was seeing crashing over me. "Those skeletons, they were people?" Victor nodded, as though discussing a scientific observation. "Yes, the researchers who stayed behind when the storm came. They didn't understand what they were dealing with." I felt my grip tighten on my rifle. "You're saying this thing killed them?" Victor's expression grew eerily calm. "It didn't just kill them, it fed on them. It's a predator, Logan, one that thrives in the dark. Like all living things, it needs to eat." "Why didn't you leave with the others?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Victor's grin widened, unhinged. "Leave and abandon this discovery? No, I stayed. To learn. To understand." He turned back to the console, his fingers flying over the keys as the hum of machinery filled the air. I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to leave. The air seemed heavier now, colder, as though something unseen was pressing down on me. Whatever Victor had trapped in that room, it was clear that I wasn't just a spectator anymore. I was part of it now. Victor's unsettling grin stayed etched on his face as he worked the console. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the observation window, where the skeletal remains painted a horrifying picture of what had happened in this place. The thought of staying here any longer sent a fresh wave of dread through me. "Victor," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need to leave. Whatever you've got in there, it's not my problem." He didn't look up, his focus locked on the screens. "You think you can just walk out of here, Logan? That's not how this works." I tightened my grip on the rifle, my pulse racing. "I don't care how it works. I'm getting back to my plane, and I'm leaving." Victor finally turned, his expression shifting from amused to deadly serious. "You don't understand. This isn't just a predator, it's something more. If you leave, you won't get far. Not in this storm, and not with it out there." I took a step back, my boots scraping against the tile. "Then why haven't you left?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because someone has to keep it contained. Someone has to study it. You think I'm crazy, but I've seen what it can do. If it gets out..." He trailed off, his eyes flicking to the console, his expression haunted. "That's not my problem," I said, my voice hardening. "Open the door, Victor." Victor shook his head slowly. "You'll never make it. Open it." I barked, raising the rifle. For a moment, the tension hung thick in the air. Then Victor smirked, as though he knew something I didn't. He reached for a button on the console, and I stepped forward, the barrel of the rifle trained on him. "Don't!" I shouted. He paused, his hand hovering over the button. "You're already part of this, Logan, whether you like it or not." Before I could react, he pressed the button. The hum of machinery grew louder, and I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy locks disengaging. "What did you do?" I demanded, my voice rising. Victor stepped back, his grin returning. "I gave it what it's been waiting for." A low, guttural screech echoed through the facility, reverberating off the walls. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait to find out what was coming. Turning on my heel, I bolted for the door. Behind me, I heard Victor's voice, faint and almost gleeful. "Run, Logan, let's see how far you get." The hallway seemed longer now, the fluorescent lights flickering as the screeching grew louder. My boots pounded against the floor as I raced back toward the entrance. I didn't know what Victor had unleashed, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to get to Maggie before it reached me. The facility seemed alive with noise now, creaks, groans, and the faint sound of movement. Whatever Victor had trapped was free, and it was hunting. I sprinted down the hallway, my breath coming in sharp bursts. Behind me, the sound of the locks disengaging was followed by something far worse, a low, guttural wail that reverberated through the walls. It was closer now, impossibly close, and I could feel its presence pressing in as though the air itself carried its malice. The facility's lights flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. I glanced back, heart hammering, and caught a glimpse of movement, something dark and fluid, slipping through the dim corridor like smoke with intent. I shoved through the door to the main lab, slamming it behind me and fumbling to lock it. My hands trembled as I scanned the room, searching for anything to slow it down. Tables and equipment were scattered across the space, and I shoved a heavy cart against the door, hoping it would buy me a few seconds. The lab was eerily silent except for the faint hum of machinery. My eyes darted to the restricted access door leading to the visitors area. I had to make it outside, but every fiber of my being screamed that I wasn't alone. The screech came again, louder and sharper this time, and I heard a faint scraping sound like claws against metal. It was here, on the other side of the door. My grip on the rifle tightened as the air seemed to grow colder. The door shuddered violently, and the cart screeched against the floor as it slid an inch. Whatever was out there wasn't going to stop. I bolted for the exit, tearing through the next door and into the visitor's room. The warm light from the fireplace was almost surreal after the sterile, flickering hallways, but I didn't stop to take it in. I grabbed my emergency pack and slung it over my shoulder, then yanked the front door open. The storm had eased, the wind a whisper compared to its earlier roar, but the snow was still thick, blanketing everything in white. I could just make out the path leading back to the landing strip, my tracks from earlier already half covered. Behind me, the sound of shattering wood erupted, followed by that haunting wail. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a wave of dread that made my chest tighten and my legs feel like lead. I didn't look back. I ran. The snow slowed me down, my boots sinking with every step, but I forced myself to push forward. The trees loomed around me, their shadows stretching unnaturally in the faint light. My lungs burned, the icy air tearing at my throat, but I didn't dare stop. The screech came again, closer this time, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. Through the swirling snow, I saw it, an amorphous black shape moving with unnatural speed, slipping between the trees like a predator closing in on its prey. The landing strip wasn't far now. Maggie's bright yellow frame stood out against the snow, a beacon of hope in the desolation. I just had to make it a little farther. But the shadow was faster. It was gaining on me, its form twisting and shifting, the air around it seeming to warp. My legs screamed in protest, but I pushed harder, each step a desperate bid for survival. The wail came again, so close now that I could feel it vibrating in my chest. The black shape surged forward, and for a moment, I thought it would overtake me. Then I reached Maggie. I threw myself against the cargo hatch, yanking it open and scrambling inside. My hands fumbled with the latch as I slammed it shut, sealing myself inside. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then came the sound of something brushing against the fuselage, moving around the plane, searching. I pressed my back against the bulkhead, clutching the rifle tightly. Outside, the shadow circled, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the chase. I wasn't safe yet, not by a long shot. I had to get Maggie started and in the air before it found a way in. My fingers trembled as I reached for the controls, praying that she would save me one more time. The cabin of Maggie felt suffocating, the silence amplifying every sound. My breaths came fast and shallow, fogging the windows. Outside, the shadow moved with eerie precision, circling the plane like a predator toying with its prey. Every few seconds, I heard the faint scrape of something against the fuselage, sending a chill down my spine. I forced my trembling hands to steady as I reached for the controls. Battery master on. The dashboard lit up with a comforting glow. Fuel selector to center, mixture lever forward. My mind ran through the startup sequence like a mantra, trying to drown out the terror clawing at my thoughts. A loud thud jolted me. Something heavy slammed against the cargo door, making it rattle violently. I froze, gripping the yoke, my eyes darting to the windows. The shadow wasn't circling anymore. It was focused on me now. "Come on, Maggie," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Don't let me down." Fuel oil shutoff lever down. Throttle at 10%. My fingers moved automatically, but my heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. The shadow pressed against the windshield now, shrouding the glass in an unnatural blackness. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence. A malice so profound it seemed to seep into the cabin. I flipped the primer switch and pressed the starter. The engine groaned, sluggish and unresponsive. My stomach sank. The issues I'd noticed before the emergency landing weren't going to make this easy. Another thud, louder this time. The plane shook as if the shadow was testing its strength against Maggie's defenses. A high-pitched screech echoed through the cabin, more intense than before. It wasn't just sound, it was pure dread, drilling into my skull. The starter motor coughed, sputtered, and then caught. Maggie's radial engine roared to life, the deep drone filling the cabin and drowning out the noise of the shadow. Relief surged through me, but I wasn't safe yet. I pushed the throttle forward, the plane lurching as the Tundra tires fought against the deep snow. The shadow clung to the windshield, its form twisting and writhing, trying to block my vision. I gritted my teeth and kept going, praying Maggie's power would break free of the snow's grip. The plane jolted forward, gaining speed. The shadow's hold seemed to weaken, slipping off the windshield as Maggie pushed harder. The landing strip loomed ahead, the trees on either side like towering sentinels. I pulled back on the yoke gently, feeling the wheels lift off the snow. The moment Maggie's tires left the ground, the shadow lunged. It stretched upward, a black mass reaching for the plane, but the distance grew quickly. The wail came again, loud and piercing, but this time it sounded desperate, almost enraged. I didn't look back. Maggie climbed steadily, her engine humming as she carried me higher, away from the shadow and the horrors below. I banked south, heading toward Fairbanks, my body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. As I glanced at the instruments, I noticed the engine miss had returned, a subtle vibration that threatened to escalate. But I didn't care. Maggie had saved me, just like she always did. Behind me, the landing strip disappeared into the swirling snow, and with it the shadow. For now, I was alive, but the image of that dark, twisting form would haunt me forever. The engine hummed unevenly, a reminder that Maggie wasn't out of danger yet. Each vibration made my pulse spike, but I couldn't afford to panic. The storm had eased, and the stars were beginning to peek through breaks in the clouds, casting a faint glow over the endless snow-covered wilderness below. I glanced back toward the landing strip, now lost in the swirling white behind me. The shadow's last desperate wail still echoed in my ears, a sound I couldn't shake. I had escaped for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Ahead, Fairbanks was still a long way off, and Maggie's engine was limping. I adjusted the throttle, coaxing her along as gently as I could. "Come on, girl," I muttered, patting the dashboard. "Just get me home." The radio crackled to life, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Viking 320 Foxtrot, Viking ground. Come in, Hoop. Do you copy?" It was Buck's voice, calm and steady despite the static. Relief washed over me. I grabbed the mic, my hand shaking. "Viking ground, this is 320 Foxtrot. I'm airborne and heading south. Do you copy?" "Roger that, Hoop," Buck replied. "We've been tracking your emergency beacon. What's your status?" I hesitated, glancing at the instruments. The altimeter was steady, but the engine's hiccups were growing more frequent. "I've got engine issues, but I'm holding steady for now. I'll need a mechanic ready when I land." "Understood," Buck said. There was a pause, then his tone shifted, tinged with concern. "What happened out there? You didn't call in for a while, and the storm wasn't showing on the radar anymore." I gripped the yoke tighter, my mind racing. How could I even begin to explain what had happened? The shadow, the skeletons, Victor Tate and his madness. It sounded impossible, even to me. "There was trouble at the research station," I said carefully, keeping my voice level. "I'll explain everything when I'm on the ground." Another pause. "All right, Hoop, just focus on getting home. We'll be ready for you." I set the mic down and exhaled slowly. The familiar rhythm of the radio exchange helped calm me, grounding me in the here and now. Fairbanks wasn't far. I just had to hold it together a little longer. But as I looked out over the snowy expanse, my relief was short-lived. Something caught my eye, a faint movement in the darkness below. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the moon on the trees. But it wasn't. The black shape moved with purpose, twisting and flowing like smoke carried on the wind. It was following me. My grip on the yoke tightened and my heart raced. It couldn't be possible. I had left it behind, hadn't I? But the shadow was unmistakable, its dark form gliding over the snow, keeping pace with Maggie. I pushed the throttle forward, ignoring the engine's protests. Maggie surged ahead, the vibration intensifying, but I didn't care. My only thought was to stay ahead of whatever was out there. The shadow didn't waver. It stayed below me, relentless, as if it were waiting for its chance. For the first time since taking off, I wondered if I would make it back to Fairbanks at all. The dark shape below moved like liquid night, flowing over the snow and weaving through the sparse trees. It wasn't bound by terrain or gravity, and that made it all the more terrifying. I pushed Maggie harder, the engine growling in protest, the vibrations rattling the controls. The radio crackled again. "Hoop, you're coming in fast on the radar. What's going on up there?" Buck's voice cut through the tension, grounding me for a moment. I grabbed the mic, my voice tight. "I'm being followed, Buck. Something from the research station. I don't know how to explain it, but it's not natural." "Followed?" Buck's tone sharpened with alarm. "What do you mean? Another aircraft?" "No," I said, glancing at the black mass below. "It's not a plane. I hesitated, unsure how to put it into words. "It's something else, something I don't think we're supposed to understand." The radio fell silent for a moment before Buck replied. "All right, Hoop, keep your heading and altitude. We'll be ready for anything when you get here." I wanted to believe him, but how could anyone be ready for this? Maggie's engine sputtered again, a harsh cough that made my stomach drop. I adjusted the throttle, trying to coax her along, but the shadow below didn't falter. It moved with the same eerie grace, a predator waiting for its moment. Then it happened. The shadow surged upward, rising from the snow like a black wave. It climbed fast, too fast, and in seconds it was level with me. My breath caught as it closed the gap, swirling and shifting outside Maggie's windows. The air inside the cabin seemed to grow colder, the light dimmer, as if the shadow was sapping the warmth and brightness from the world around it. I could feel it pressing against the plane, a malevolent force that wanted in. I banked hard to the left, hoping to shake it, but the shadow followed, sticking to Maggie like a second skin. Its form writhed and twisted, and for a horrifying moment, it seemed to seep through the cracks in the windows, a thin tendril of darkness curling into the cabin. "No!" I shouted, slamming my hand against the controls as if sheer willpower could keep it out. The tendril recoiled, retreating back to the mass outside, but the shadow didn't give up. It swirled faster, wrapping around the plane like a constricting serpent. Maggie groaned under the strain, her frame shuddering as if the shadow's presence was more than just physical. I gritted my teeth and pushed the throttle to its limit, the engine roaring in protest. "Hold together, girl," I muttered, my voice shaking, just a little farther. Through the chaos, a faint light appeared on the horizon. Fairbanks. It was distant, but it was there, a beacon of hope in the frozen wilderness. The shadow seemed to sense it too. Its movements grew more frantic, its screeches louder and sharper, echoing in my ears like nails on glass. It was now or never. I gripped the yoke, my knuckles white, and aimed Maggie straight for the lights ahead. The shadow surged again, pressing harder, but I refused to slow down. Fairbanks was my only chance, and I wasn't going to let this thing take me before I reached it. Maggie groaned, the engine misfiring with every few beats, but she held steady. Together we pushed forward, the shadow clinging to us like a nightmare given form. Fairbanks' lights shimmered on the horizon, a lifeline in the frozen expanse. I kept my eyes locked on them, ignoring the growing chaos inside and outside Maggie. The shadow pressed against the fuselage, its writhing form distorting the faint glow from the instruments. Every groan from the airframe felt like a warning, but there was no turning back. The radio crackled again. "Hoop, you're almost here. What's your status?" Buck's voice was calm, but I could hear the urgency beneath it. "Not good," I replied, gripping the mic with trembling fingers. "The engine's failing, and that thing, it's still here. It's on the plane." "What thing?" Buck asked, his voice rising. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said, my voice strained. "Just be ready when I land, and make sure the lights are bright, every single one of them." "Roger that," Buck said, and the line went quiet. Maggie shuddered violently, the shadow tightening its grip. The windows fogged, not from the cold but from something else, a creeping darkness that seemed to bleed through the glass. The tendrils returned, thin and searching, curling into the cabin. I swung the rifle around, aiming at the closest tendril, and fired. The deafening crack of the shot echoed in the small cabin, and the shadow recoiled with a shriek that rattled the controls. The tendrils withdrew, but the mass outside grew angrier, its screeches louder and more piercing. The engine sputtered again, and I felt Maggie lose altitude. "No, no, no," I muttered, coaxing the throttle forward. The vibration in the yoke was stronger now, and the altimeter's needle dipped dangerously low. Ahead, the lights of Fairbanks grew closer, brighter. I could make out the runway, a strip of safety in the encroaching darkness. I had to land. There was no other option. The shadow seemed to sense my determination. It surged upward, enveloping the cockpit in blackness. I couldn't see the instruments, the horizon, or even my own hands. It was as if the world outside Maggie no longer existed. "Come on, Maggie," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Don't give up on me now." I switched to instruments only, trusting the altimeter and airspeed indicators to guide me. The runway was less than a mile away, and I knew I had one chance to get this right. The shadow screeched again, its sound deafening, as if it were trying to drown out my focus. I fought against the noise, the darkness, and the overwhelming weight of fear pressing on my chest. Finally, the landing lights pierced through the black. I could see them, faint but steady, guiding me home. The shadow twisted violently, its tendrils lashing out in one last desperate attempt to stop me. But I was already descending, the runway rushing up to meet us. The wheels hit the tarmac with a jarring thud, and Maggie bounced once before settling into a rough but stable roll. I throttled back, the engine groaning as the plane slowed. The shadow didn't retreat, it clung to the plane, its form shifting and writhing, refusing to let go. Ahead, I saw the hangar doors open, light pouring out like a beacon. Figures stood silhouetted against the glow, their movements hurried. I brought Maggie to a halt just outside the hangar, killing the engine and yanking the emergency brake. The shadow screeched one final time, its sound cutting through the night like a knife. Then it stopped. The darkness around the plane dissolved, slipping away like smoke on the wind. I sat frozen in the cockpit, my chest heaving as I tried to process what had just happened. The hangar crew rushed toward me, their voices a blur, but all I could do was stare into the night, half expecting the shadow to return. The hangar crew reached Maggie, their flashlights cutting through the night as they climbed onto the wing to open the door. Buck's voice called out from below, steady and reassuring. "Hoop, you all right? Talk to me." I unbuckled my harness with shaking hands and stumbled out of the cockpit. The cold air hit me like a wall, but it was nothing compared to the icy dread that still gripped my chest. Buck grabbed my arm as I climbed down, steadying me. "What the hell happened out there?" he asked, his face pale in the glow of the hangar lights. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain something that defied logic, that felt like it came from another world? I just shook my head, glancing back at Maggie. Her bright yellow frame was streaked with dark smudges, almost like soot, but nothing looked broken or out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something unseen. It was something from the research station, I finally managed, my voice hoarse. I don't know what it was, but it followed me. It tried to get in. Buck frowned, glancing at the other crew members who were inspecting Maggie. "Followed you? What are you talking about?" I grabbed his shoulder, my grip tighter than I intended. "We need to keep the lights on. All of them. Whatever that thing was, it doesn't like the light." Buck stared at me for a long moment before nodding. "All right, Hoop. Let's get you inside." He guided me into the hangar, where the warmth and brightness were a stark contrast to the dark, frigid night outside. I sank onto a bench, my body trembling from a mix of exhaustion and lingering fear. Dan, the mechanic, jogged in from outside, his face serious. "Hoop, what's with the black streaks on Maggie? You didn't mention a fire." "There was no fire," I said quickly. "It wasn't that kind of damage." Dan exchanged a glance with Buck, then crouched in front of me. "All right, what kind of damage are we talking about?" I shook my head. "I don't know how to explain it. Just check her over, all right? And be careful." Dan nodded and headed back outside, but not before giving Buck a wary look. Buck sat down next to me, his voice softer now. "Hoop, you're scaring the hell out of me. Start from the beginning. What happened at that station?" I told him everything, the emergency call, the storm, Victor Tate, the skeletons, and the shadow that had pursued me. My words came in fits and starts, each memory pulling at the fear I'd tried to suppress. Buck didn't interrupt, but his expression grew darker with every detail. When I finished, he let out a slow breath and ran a hand through his hair. "That's a lot to take in." "I know how it sounds," I said, my voice cracking. "But it's real. That thing. It's still out there." Buck didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to the hangar doors, peering out into the night. The snow had stopped and the wind had died down, but the darkness felt heavier than it should have. "We'll keep the lights on," he said finally, his tone resolute. And I'll make some calls. If there's something out there, we'll figure it out. I nodded, grateful for his calm determination, but deep down, I wasn't sure if anyone could truly prepare for what I'd encountered. The shadows might have retreated for now, but I knew they weren't gone. Not completely. Part 14. Lingering Darkness. Hours later, I sat in the hangar's office wrapped in a blanket with a steaming mug of coffee in my hands. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind an exhaustion so deep it felt like my bones might give out. But sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow twisting outside Maggie, felt its malevolence pressing against me. Buck had made good on his promise to keep the lights on. The hangar was bathed in an unrelenting glow, the fluorescence buzzing softly overhead. Outside, floodlights illuminated the tarmac, casting long shadows that danced faintly in the wind. I couldn't help but flinch every time one moved. Dan entered the office, wiping his hands on a rag. He sat across from me, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "I've gone over Maggie 3 times now," he said. "The engine's banged up, sure, but there's no sign of anything unusual." "What about the black streaks?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dan shook his head. "Gone. Wiped right off, like they were never there." He hesitated, then leaned forward. "Hoop, you sure you're okay? You've been through a lot. Maybe—" "I'm not imagining it," I snapped, harsher than I intended. Dan raised his hands in a placating gesture, and I sighed, my shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to explain it." Buck joined us, carrying a thick folder. He dropped it on the table with a thud. "I dug into the records for that research station," he said. "White River Basin Agricultural Research Center. Officially, it's been shuttered for months. Budget cuts, they said. No mention of a Victor Tate or anyone else being stationed there." My stomach twisted. "That's not possible. I was there, Buck. He was there, and so was whatever that thing was." Buck nodded grimly. "I believe you, Hoop, but there's no paper trail, no record of what they were really doing out there." The room fell into a heavy silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the hangar doors. I glanced toward the windows, half expecting to see the shadow waiting for me, but there was only darkness. Dan cleared his throat. "So, what now?" Buck leaned against the table, his gaze steady. "Now, we stay alert. Whatever this is, it's not over. Not by a long shot." I nodded, gripping the coffee mug like it was a lifeline. Deep down, I knew Buck was right. The shadow might have retreated into the wilderness, but it was still out there, waiting, watching. And I couldn't shake the feeling that one day it would return. For now, all I could do was hold on to the light and pray it would be enough.